Good day, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you all for joining us at this timely discussion. My name is Alqaed. I'm the Director of Programs at Gulf International Forum. 18 days ago, a conflict that began with strikes on Iran has rapidly become a regional stress test. A test of borders, sovereignty, airspace, state authority, and diplomacy. In the next 75 minutes or so, we will focus on how 6 key states, each with different alliances and vulnerabilities, are trying to protect sovereignty and prevent spillover while the war continues. Responses from Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt matter enormously because they sit on key geographic corridors with important diplomatic and security relationships. And in some cases, they have or they contain powerful armed actors operating outside full state control. The shared headlines for 6 states have converged around one core principle: sovereignty. Each government is in its own way saying we will not be a platform for someone else's war, and we want de-escalation through diplomacy. But the similarities end when we look at each state, at what each state can do. And there are different cases within the 6 states. Jordan is facing the frontline airspace problem. Operationally, Jordan has been intercepting drones and ballistic missiles, violating its airspace or targeting its territories. Meanwhile, Ankara is facing a different kind of airspace frontline, one inside NATO. And NATO defenses have intercepted multiple Iranian missiles over Turkish airspace. At the same time, Turkish president warned that the war must stop before the whole region is dragged in, and Ankara signaled readiness to support mediation. Egypt is also playing a role in the crisis as a crisis manager and also as a mediator, trying to play a role as a mediator, while acting to protect critical transport and economic stability. President Abdel Fattah Sisi condemned Iran targeting Arab states, and Cairo declared readiness to mediate, with explicit language about sovereignty and non-interference. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, probably we have the clearest case of state caught between the war's major actors and its own internal landscape. The official language points to fear of being dragged into the conflict. However, Iran-backed Iraqi militias targeted US sites in Iraq, followed by strikes on PMF locations. And Baghdad is attempting to lower further escalation within its borders. Lebanon shows how sovereignty becomes a struggle over state authority. Despite the calls from the Lebanese prime minister and presidents and warning to Hezbollah from launching missiles, Hezbollah did launch a missile on northern Israel, and Israel retaliated with airstrike across Lebanon, resulting the killings of hundreds of civilians and displacements of nearly 1 million Lebanese. And in response, Lebanese president offered for the first time direct talks with Israel. And finally, in Syria, probably maybe the safest country in the Middle East right now, has publicly condemned Iranian attacks on GCC and Jordan. However, President Shara mobilized troops to the Lebanese borders, Syrian-Lebanese borders, claiming that this is for defensive posture. A few days later, a missile hit the Syrian town of Sirgaya on the borders with Lebanon, likely by Hezbollah. And the situation indicates that it could quickly generate a new sensitive dilemma for the country and for the fragile security in the country, and direct confrontation between the new Syrian military and the Iranian proxies. Too many variables to discuss. And to unfold the regional positions and fears, I am really honored to be joined today by an excellent line of speakers. Today we have Dr. Lina Khatib, is an associate fellow at the MENA program at Chatham House, principal analyst at Extract, and visiting scholar with the Harvard Kennedy School Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center. Previously, she was director of SOAS Middle East Institute and professor at SOAS as well, And also she served as director of the MENA program at Chatham House. We also joined today. We're also joined today by Dr. Hellyer, who's a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Service Institute for Defense and Security Studies, RUSI. And he's also a senior fellow in the geopolitics and security at the Center of American Progress, bringing more than 20 years of transatlantic policy experience to the analysis of political risk, regional order, and strategic competition across the Middle East, Europe, and South Asia. We are also joined by Aslı Aydıntaşbaş, who's a fellow at the center, who's a foreign policy fellow in the Center of the United States and Europe, and the director of the Turkey project in Brookings Institution. She's also a senior associate fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And prior to joining foreign policy community, Aslı had a long career in journalism, during which she focused on Turkey, its domestic evolution, and foreign policy in the age of regional reshuffling. Finally, we're joined by Victoria Taylor, who's the director of Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council Middle East Program. She's a national security leader with over 2 decades of experience in the Middle East and Europe. She led large interagency teams and advanced U.S. economic and national security interests as Deputy Assistant Secretary, Deputy Chief of Mission, and at the White House National Security Council. Thank you all for joining us today. It's really a pleasure. Victoria, if I may start with you, with Iraq, one of the 9 countries we study here at the forum. And I would like to ask about how does the view appear from Iraq with the multiple positions on the conflict between the official government stance, the PMF, different political factions? How are these competing positions shaping Iraq's overall position toward the war?
Thanks, Anas, for having me. So I think, Iraq is in an extremely challenging position right now because it's probably the only country that's being struck by both sides of the conflict and also from within. Of course, we have Iran striking the Iranian Kurdish opposition that's resident in Kurdistan. We have the U.S. striking militia targets and militia leaders right now. And then you have the Iran-backed militias, which now are not only striking U.S. targets, both diplomatic and military, but which are really somewhat indiscriminately launching rocket and drone attacks at sites throughout the country. And so I think what we have here is really the culmination of some of the contradictions within the Iraqi state, where you have an official government position which is very focused on keeping Iraq out of the war, but actors like the militia, which operate both outside of the direction of the government, but also are on the payroll of the government. And those militias are actually taking steps that are dragging Iraq just more deeply into the conflict. And so I think, right now, of course, the leading politicians within the Shia coordination framework, I think, are focused on how they can find a way to really halt this violence in Iraq that is challenging some of their government policies that they've worked very hard on over the past 2 years, including trying to encourage international and Western investments. But then you have some of these same militia groups that are launching the strikes who have political factions that are actually part of the formal political process. And so I think we're seeing really a growing division even within those militia groups. Some of the militia groups now, like Asab al-Haq and Badr, they are not launching kinetic strikes. They've been, over the past several years, much more focused on entrenching their political and economic interests in the country. But then you still have this really radical core of militia groups like Khatib, Hezbollah, Harakat al-Nujaba, which are not only launching strikes right now, but were the groups that were launching strikes in this post-October 7th period. And so I think the core challenge right now is that the Iraqi government seems in effect powerless to really stop this violence and figure out a way, either through negotiation with the groups or through action at the security level to prevent these kinds of attacks from happening. I think it's really the culmination of some of the challenges that Iraq has been facing now, and it's unclear whether we can kind of return to this more stable status quo that existed, following February 2024 and the end of the attacks, and this period now.
Thank you, Victoria. Lina, moving to Lebanon, I think it's another front in the Middle East that is outside the Gulf that is involved directly and indirectly, actually, both ways in the war. Hezbollah is already deeply involved in the conflict. How are the Lebanese government and different political factions responding to this war? And in your opinion, what risks does the current escalation pose to Lebanon internal stability?
Thank you. First, I just want to correct that my current affiliations are Associate Fellow at Chatham House and Visiting Scholar at Harvard, no other affiliations. When it comes to your question, Lebanon is facing a really critical crisis because shades of Iraq in a way, because you have Hezbollah, which is a group that until very recently, let's put it that way, was considered legitimate in the country and is fast losing this legitimacy because it is not acting according to the wishes of the Lebanese government. And currently, after the Lebanese government took the decision to ban Hezbollah's military and security activities, Hezbollah's actions currently, the military actions against Israel, are squarely illegal. And yet, the Lebanese government, which did not want Lebanon to be involved in this war in any way, has not been able to stop Hezbollah. And this is because the Lebanese government does not have the capacity, neither militarily nor politically, to be able to do that. And meanwhile, Lebanon is facing increasing pressure from Israel. Israel is saying to the Lebanese government that Lebanon needs to stop Hezbollah's attacks on Israel before Israel is ready to contemplate any form of negotiation with Lebanon, which is not realistic for the issues that I mentioned regarding lack of capacity. So in a way, this leaves Lebanon hostage. On the one hand, it has Israel that is determined to go all out to neutralize the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israeli security. And at the same time, you have Hezbollah, which is simply not listening to the Lebanese government and has not listened for a while. I mean, after the ceasefire that was signed between Lebanon, actually, it's a ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and Israel in November 2024, the agreement said that Hezbollah should disarm, and the Lebanese government called upon Hezbollah to do so repeatedly, but Hezbollah kept refusing. And we know why Hezbollah kept refusing. It's because Hezbollah takes orders of war and peace from Iran, and Iran wanted to keep Hezbollah as a potential defense tool to be activated were Iran to find itself facing an existential threat. And this war now in Iran is such a threat to the regime there. And that's why it asked Hezbollah to intervene, even though this is not in the Lebanese national interest. So all this is causing a lot of tension in Lebanon because it's causing huge humanitarian devastation. And at the same time, there is political tension regarding what to do next. I think the only way out is for Lebanon to have a lot of external support for the Lebanese government so that it is able to stand up to Hezbollah domestically. I think the expectation that it should be the other way around, that the Lebanese government should have domestic clout over Hezbollah before it can negotiate things externally, is not realistic.
Thank you, Lina. Dr. Hellyer, if I may move to Egypt and its strategic position, how is Cairo assessing the current war between Iran and Israel and the United States. What is Egypt's perspective and the primary regional risks and maybe strategic interests shaping its response in this conflict?
Well, thank you very much, Anas. And from the outset, allow me to say it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I thank the forum for not having just invited me, but assembling a really illustrious panel. And on a very key topic. When it comes to Egypt, Egypt has made it very clear, not simply in the last few weeks, not in the last few months, but for quite a number of years, that is the designs of Israeli paramountcy in the region are quite dangerous. But it also views, I think, any threat that would cause instability in the Gulf, and particularly when it comes to the Straits of Hormuz and the resultant impacts on energy prices and oil prices and so forth, to be very damaging indeed. So in this regard, they're really quite, I would say, in lockstep with their Gulf allies and the GCC more generally. They don't look forward to escalation anywhere in the region at all. On the contrary, they've been very pragmatic on a regional basis. They want to pursue the de-escalation paradigm, but at the same time, I think they do see Iranian strikes as being quite threatening to regional stability. But I think that if you were to ask officials in Cairo, and I think this is true, frankly, across the Arab world, what major threats they see in the region right now, Iran would definitely be up there at the very top, but so would the threat of Israeli paramountcy, where Israel has been striking Syria, Lebanon, as we've just discussed, Palestine, and so forth.
Thank you so much. Aslı, the view from Turkey. Turkey has been, intercepting several Iranian missiles, actually NATO forces, and but how does it interpreting the war between Iran, Israel, and the US, and what factors are shaping right now Ankara's response to the conflict?
And let me also thank you for bringing us together with colleagues, many of whom I know through their writing and social media presence, and really happy that also we're discussing this from the periphery, but nonetheless countries that are hugely affected by this war. For Turkey, this is the nightmare scenario they had long been hoping to avoid in the run-up to the war. They had been pretty active in trying to form a coalition, a regional coalition, to push for a negotiated settlement. They had also been using their links within the Trump administration, their contacts to the Trump administration to make a case for diplomacy, but obviously that hasn't brought anything. I think the scenario that Turkey has feared, which is happening right now, is pretty much an open-ended conflict at this point, with possibility of escalation on both sides. Regional trade and economy and energy links hugely disrupted, not to mention the sort of enormous human cost that's being felt across the region, of course in Iran also, but in Beirut and elsewhere in the Gulf countries too. In addition, I think the fact that Iranian regime is still entrenched, we don't know how firmly, but at least from the outside in the first 18 days of the war, what looks like happening is that the very hardline elements of the regime which President Trump was hoping to dislodge are in place. There has been a change in the regime, not a regime change, and that change that happened is for the worse, towards a more hardened nationalist IRGC that is now running, that now has a devolved command structure, making it all the more dangerous for the Gulf countries, but also for Turkey. As you've mentioned, Turkey has been the target of Iranian missiles, only 3 so far, and they were mostly targeting US or NATO facilities in Turkey. But I think that beyond this issue, the regional instability and the open-ended nature of this conflict is something that Ankara is very much concerned with. There does not seem to be a huge appetite for an off-ramp at this point, certainly not here, but also by Iranians, one of the key figures that has in the past negotiated with Turkey in nuclear talks and other conversations with the international community, Ali Larijani, though a hardliner himself, also seen as a pragmatist figure by many in the region, has been killed in an Israeli strike yesterday. So I think the links to Iranian system to at some point ultimately down the road negotiate an off-ramp are getting less and less. That is obviously one issue that concerns Turkey, in addition to possibility of mass migration. As you know, in the Syrian conflict over 13 years, Turkey has been on the receiving end of migration. The government has pretty much embraced Syrian refugees, even though that was a very controversial issue in the domestic conversation and in domestic politics. But I think that Turkey is very cautious about a new wave of migration, a continued instability in Iran, which could implode, lead to a civil war, and create an Iran that's fragmented, but possibly even more dangerous than what they had. And perhaps another issue to flag here in terms of Turkey's approach and concerns is the very obvious, clear discomfort with the role that Israel is playing in the region as sort of since the 12th Day War, since I would say over the past 2 years maybe, but since the 12th Day War as a new regional hegemon, working with United States often, but sometimes having a divergent policy that's a lot more risky than US policies. And I think that Turkey for the longest time was hoping that there would be a divergence between Trump administration's outlook on the war in Iran and Israel's, that the Trump administration would be more cautious and less risky. I think at this point it's not clear that there is a huge divergence or that President Trump is able to de-escalate. So I think that Israel's new role, its ability to use the airspace across the region, not Turkey's airspace, of course, but all of its neighbors, and possibly level of Israeli comfort with the idea of an Iran that implodes, that is chaotic, and where ethnic conflict and sort of prolonged civil war, the fact that Israelis are not hugely uncomfortable with that is something that concerns Turkey. This is also a setback in many ways in Turkey's efforts to reset relations with Washington and its NATO allies with the Trump administration, not because there is public disagreement. Turkish officials have been very cautious not to criticize President Trump or Washington when it comes to this war. But I think it takes away the concentration from the very difficult diplomatic steps that are needed to normalize Turkish-US relations, starting with sanctions, CAATSA sanctions, the S-400 saga, F-35s, and so on and so forth. There's a long list of bilateral issues that I think Ankara was hoping could be wrapped up until the midterms. And with Washington on war footing, I think it's hard to imagine the level of concentration and focus on some of those issues, which do require sort of processes, diplomatic processes and congressional processes that are not so easy. So
thank you.
I think Turkey in many ways is very much going through the nightmare scenario that it feared it would.
Thank you. Dr. Khatib, if I may ask about the view, since we are in Turkey, so Damascus and Amman are very close. If I may ask about the view from these two states, what are their concerns? Both of them are pretty much affected the war spillovers?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Jordan, it's directly affected. And perhaps Victoria might want to say more about this, because some of the Iraqi militias have at least claimed that they have targeted Jordan. So there is a real security issue there. When it comes to Syria, this is one of those few occasions in which Syria is not a hub of volatility. If anything, the absence, more or less, of US targets in Syria has helped the country in a way protect itself as this war rages on around it. Of course, there were some rumors about Syrian forces getting involved in entering Lebanon to counter Hezbollah, but those remain just rumors. The issue is not just political, which is a very big sensitive issue in Lebanon, to have a repeat of a scenario in which Syrian troops enter the country supposedly to stabilize it. But also the issue is that for the Syrian government itself, the capacity of its military is still quite weak and barely able to hold the situation together inside Syria, as we have seen, for example, with ISIS and some actually Iran-backed groups that have tried to stir trouble in the country, especially last year, trying to exploit the weak security sector in Syria. So in general, I don't think it's likely that the conflict will spread in Syria. Syria also will not want to find itself at war with Hezbollah. This is not in the Syrian interest. So at best, Syria is trying to shield itself.
Thank you. Victoria, going back to Iraq, there is a risk of escalation, further escalation inside Iraq, or dragging Iraq further to the heart of the war. What are these risks? Could be maybe in the north, Kurdish fighters, or a further escalation by the PMF or other Iranian-backed militias in Iraq targeting GCC states, like we saw in 2019?
So I think that escalation is already here in terms of Iraq. And Dr. Khatib already mentioned, Iraqi militias launching attacks in Jordan. I mean, we are at a point already where the militias have begun launching attacks not only at U.S. diplomatic facilities and military facilities, but launching attacks at Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan. And also in response, we've seen the United States, launch some of the most significant strikes against militia leaders. Just this past Friday, it appears the U.S. tried to take out Khatib Hezbollah leader Hamadawi. While it appears that he survived, that seems to be probably the highest level leadership strike that the United States has taken in Iraq since Qasem Soleimani. On Monday, we saw another U.S. targeted leadership strike, which appears to have killed several IRGC commanders who were acting as advisors to the militias. And I think, the real challenge here is now not only the possibility of further escalation, but I think it's really a major question about whether you could even return to the prior status quo. And it's not clear at this point whether, even the halt of U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran would necessarily end this back and forth between the militias and the United States. It could get worse. I think, were the militias striking at Israel, that could certainly invite an Israeli response, which we could anticipate would be very significant. That has not happened to date. And I think, the U.S. military presence and this idea that Iraq is more, the remit of the United States has probably shielded Iraq from that kind of retaliation. There was a period in 2024 in the post-October 7th violence when Khatib, Hezbollah, and the militias were launching attacks at Israel. It's been mentioned, of course, the relationship between the Iranian Kurdish militias who are resident in Iraq. I think, there is both a desire from Baghdad and also both parties in Kurdistan to prevent any kind of active support or the active use as Iraq as a launching pad for any armed Iranian Kurdish opposition. Of course, that is very much tied to the complicated, dynamics between the various Kurdish groups and likely the U.S. Position or President Trump's decision, stated decision that the U.S. would not support such an effort was certainly a result of some outreach by the Turkish government, which was strongly opposed to having the United States arm groups, at least one of which is aligned with the PKK. And I know the Kurdish groups were very concerned about the possibility that such an effort would invite an even more significant retaliation in Kurdistan. And of course, in the past, we've also seen the Iranians launch ballistic missiles into Kurdish territory. Just in 2024, such a missile, was sent from Iran into a Kurdish businessman's house on the idea that he was, with allegation, he was part of some Mossad base. So, I would say the bottom line is I think the escalation is already here in Iraq. It's already part of the conflict, whether it wanted to be or not. That is not to say it could not get more complicated or could not get worse. The major question is whether it's possible to really contain this violence and whether an end to the fighting between the United States and Israel and Iran would necessarily end the militia fighting.
Okay. Thank you, Victoria. So many questions, but let me go back to Egypt and Turkey and the red lines for both countries and maybe opportunities as well for mediation. Dr. Hellyer, if I may ask about Egypt's role in the war if the war prolongs. If it continues for weeks and or months, what role do you see Cairo is able to play or wanting to play? And should we anticipate mediation role or greater security cooperation with the GCC states targeting, as a result of the missile launch and drone launches from Tehran?
So before I answer that, I just want to take a step back for a moment and remind people, you said, let's go back to Egypt and Turkey. And I want people to remember that in very recent history, the idea that these two countries would be cooperating on pretty much anything would have been anathema. And we've seen how that's so dramatically changed over recent months and years. Where that huge rivalry that almost brought the two countries to war in Libya has transformed tremendously, especially after the 7th of October attacks and the genocidal war that Israel wrought on Gaza. So I think that that's important just to keep in mind. We're in a historical moment where many things can change quite quickly and quite dramatically. But certain things are just structural and become very difficult to change. And one of those is the fact that when it comes to mediation, usually there's leverage that is at the hands of the mediator in order to engage people in that mediation process. And Egypt simply doesn't have that with regards to the Gulf or with regards to Iran. In fact, for a very long time, it was very difficult to even have serious conversations around Iran in Egypt because they didn't see it as a first level priority as compared to other things that were obviously much closer to home, which you can understand considering at the time there was Libya and Sudan and so on and so forth. But they don't have any leverage. They don't have the depth or strategic connection when it comes to Tehran in order to be significant in that regard. And they don't have leverage with the Gulf, on the contrary, right? So I don't think that we're likely to see a very active role when it comes to Egypt, despite the fact that in terms of actual capacity, Egypt has tremendous mediation capacity because it has one of the longest and most well-developed foreign policy apparatuses in terms of its Ministry of Foreign Affairs within the whole region, and with tremendous historic memory. So it definitely has a great deal of capacity, but then it needs to be able to bring people to the table. I think that you're more likely to see mediation coming from other actors, not even simply in the region, but outside of it, who are able to bring that leverage to the table.
Thank you. Aslı, the same question, but I want to ask about the red lines, because Turkey is sharing borders with Iran and Iraq, one of the parties of this war, and the role of mediation, possible mediation.
Well, a clear red line is obviously the Kurdish issue. As Victoria has described, this sort of 48-hour U.S. plan to arm Iranian Kurds, and only to have President Trump then reverse course and say he's ruled it out, was not really a very comfortable situation for Turkey. It feels like a return to 2014-15, when U.S. CENTCOM decided to form a relationship, an alliance, military partnership with SDF, Syrian Kurdish groups that were similarly linked to the PKK. That at the time was Syrian offshoot of the PKK, and similarly the strongest group in Iran that could take part in such an effort is PAJAK, linked to the PKK. So this becomes a very difficult domestic issue for Turkey, and a bit of an existential question. I think it is, the country has long been struggling to see how it can address its own Kurdish issue and relations with the PKK. There's a very fragile peace process inside Turkey. I say fragile, it's been going on for over a year, but the steps are really baby steps on both sides. Nonetheless, it does hold hope for sort of a Turkish-Kurdish reconfiguration in terms of what Turkey is, what its future is. And I think that is existentially a very important issue, and possibly a very significant issue for President Erdogan in electoral terms. So going back to the sort of same plan and using the Syrian template and actually arming Syrian Kurds could derail the peace process inside Turkey. And it could also, I think, introduce a certain amount of friction to, again, a very fragile integration process inside Syria. SDF's integration efforts into the Syrian government and Syrian structures are in part steps that Turkey is signing off on, to be very blunt, and encouraging. So I think there is a very sort of unpleasant scenario here in which both of these processes are derailed. And of course, Iraqi Kurdistan becomes the target of Iranian attacks. So that is one issue that is outside the dynamic for Turkey. It can obviously have huge impact in Turkey if the PKK-Turkey peace process is somehow derailed because of a new partnership with Iranian Kurds, or an Israeli partnership with Iranian Kurds, even if United States is not part of it. But it's also something that could impact Syria and the northeast of Syria. I would say there are also opportunities in this issue. Well, before opportunities, I should also highlight Turkey is very concerned about what happens in the north of Iran with Azerbaijan and Azeri minorities, Azeri Farsi minorities in Iran, and of course Azerbaijan, its close partner, being targeted. And again, potential knock-on effects in terms of the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process, which is pretty much nearing its end point with the expectation that Turkey will open its border with Armenia towards the end of this year. I think that is an important economic link to Central Asia for Turkey. There are opportunities too. Certainly opportunities for regional diplomacy and cooperation, as Dr. Hellyer has pointed out. It would have been unthinkable to talk about Turkey and Egypt being on the same page 5 years ago, but here they are. They've been talking on Gaza. They've been talking, more importantly, perhaps on Libya and other conflicts in the region, including Horn of Africa. I think Turkey does want ultimately to start a discussion on longer-term regional security architecture, and is very keen to be talking and aligning itself with Gulf Arab states. Obviously, Turkey cannot replace United States as a security provider, but it can do more in terms of addressing the security needs of this region. If and when this war is over, there will be, some suspect that there will be some soul searching about the entire security architecture of the region, and the fact that the partnership and the alliance with United States is also creating its own liabilities, and I think Turkey would also like to be part of that conversation. Can it negotiate with Iran? Can it be the country that negotiates an off-ramp? Yes, Turkish-Iranian relationship has for centuries, I should say, been a very competitive modus vivendi. These countries are not allies or friends. They never have been, but they do not interfere in each other's domestic affairs, and that has been the key component of 400 years of coexistence. So as such, I think Turkey would like to be an instrument for an off-ramp, but it's not clear that that's a path Iranians would take. I think previous efforts to organize a regional negotiation process in the run-up to the war has backfired when Iranians decided to go with Amman, in part because they did not want to discuss all the more difficult and tricky files that regional countries want to discuss with Iran, including Iranian proxies in Iraq and elsewhere, in Iran's ballistic missile programs, if and when this war is over, or in the run-up to sort of a more of a sort of end game. There might be an opportunity for a Turkey-led regional coalition to sit with Iran and actually reach a deal on some of these issues, which are, of course, very existential for Iraq, but also for other countries in the region, including Turkey.
Thank you. I want to come back to both of you, Aslı and Dr. Hellyer, to discuss about the fear in Cairo and in Ankara about regarding the rise of Israel as the sole hegemon in the region. But before, I want to talk to Dr. Khatib and Victoria about the domestic stability in both countries, in Lebanon and Iraq. There are more and more discussions about rising tension, societal tension, because of these militias in both countries dragging the country into a confrontation. In the case of Lebanon, which has clearly affected the IDPs, the displaced populations across the country. And also, I want to tie it to Syria. There has been some missiles, probably Katyusha, small missiles, launched from Lebanon to Syrian small towns on the borders with Lebanon. That could, as you mentioned, there has been calls for interference by the Syrian army, which brings bitter memories from the 1982 when both the Syrians and the Israelis entered Lebanon to push the Fatah out. What are your comments on these dynamics?
When it comes to the towns that you mentioned, Hezbollah is still trying to smuggle weapons from Syria into Lebanon. As I mentioned, there are still pockets of Iran-backed groups inside Syria that are trying to cause trouble. These are remnants, obviously, from the Assad regime era, and it is in their interest for there to be instability in Syria. And Hezbollah is, in doing this, dragging Israeli retaliation, if you can call it that, because Israel has been striking whenever it sees smuggling attempts by Hezbollah across the border. So this is not helping with the security situation. And this is one of the reasons why the smuggling, the Syrian security forces have bolstered their presence at the Lebanese border, which I think makes a lot of sense. But I don't think this means that Syria is going to do more than that vis-a-vis Hezbollah, because having a fight with Hezbollah is not in Syria's interest in any way. When it comes to Lebanon, you mentioned the issue of social tension. And I think this is a very important point to highlight, because currently there's around 1 million people who are displaced. A lot of these people were displaced before in the previous war between Hezbollah and Israel. And since then, they didn't really get much compensation, not from anyone really. Hezbollah has mostly been selling its own constituents empty promises. I have been to Lebanon multiple times during the period since the last ceasefire until this war broke out, and I keep hearing about people being given checks that turn out not to be real, promises of compensation from Hezbollah. These are Hezbollah checks, Hezbollah promises that do not materialize. And meanwhile, the Lebanese government doesn't have the funds to compensate anyone, and external donors are non-existent. And so these people who are now displaced are facing unimaginable suffering as a result of all those losses and lack of compensation by anyone. And this is exactly what Israel wants. It is trying, through imposing this hardship, to try to get the constituents of Hezbollah and the community of Hezbollah to turn against Hezbollah. That's basically the Israeli aim. What this is doing in Lebanon, of course, is causing almost a third of the Lebanese population, which happens to be Muslim Shia, to be cast in a very vulnerable position. Yes, a lot of Lebanese people may disagree politically about, being with Hezbollah, anti-Hezbollah, sympathetic to Iran or against Iran. But the key issue here on the humanitarian level is that so far, the host communities across Lebanon are treating their fellow Lebanese as human beings first. And this is so important to maintain social cohesion. Now, of course, there have been reports of some people not accepting some of the displaced because they fear that Israel might attack them, meaning those displaced people, if one of them happens to be somehow regarded as a target because of affiliation with Hezbollah. But for the most part, it is the Lebanese people who are really going out of their way to help those others who are displaced. And basically here, the issue for me is what happens when the war ends? Because when the war ends this time is not going to be the same as when the war ends last time. Last time, the status quo had changed, but not significantly. Now, with what's going on in Iran and with the likelihood of the regime in Iran collapsing, the political reference, the political framework, the financial backbone that Hezbollah represented for a huge part of the Lebanese population is not going to be there anymore. And you have a population whose worldview has been completely shattered. They had thought they were safe. They had thought they had upward social mobility, financial security as a result of rallying around Hezbollah. It's not all about ideology, and it's not all about politics as such. It has a lot to do with the socioeconomic safety net that Hezbollah also offered. So all this is ending. So you have changes militarily, financially, and at the level of politics and social dynamics. And so it is key for Lebanon to already be thinking about national reconciliation and about not alienating even the people who the majority may disagree with politically.
Thank you, Dr. Lina. Victoria, similar situation in Iraq, particularly that a main reason for the eruption of protests in 2019, the Tishreen Revolution, as it's commonly known in Iraq, was challenging the power and the complete control of the power of the militias and their complete control over the Iraqi state. And right now they are dragging the entire country into, that's how big number of Iraqis viewing it, dragging the country into a confrontation that is not of the Iraqi public choice, nor the state. How do you see a confrontation evolving in the country, a risk on the social cohesion?
Well, so I think, the most visible consequence, of course, of this war is, the very present videos that you are seeing of these militia strikes. But I think actually the more acute problem right now is economic. The Iraqi economy is completely dependent upon oil exports. Revenue, that revenue counts for over 90% of Iraq's budget. And of course, unfortunately, over this many years, Iraq has remained very dependent on oil exports through the Strait of Hormuz. And even last week, we saw an example of several tankers in the port of Basra being blown up by Iraqi ships that hit it. So I think, in the absence of really a resolution to the closure of the straits or Iraq's ability to successfully negotiate with the Iranians, Iraq is facing a huge budget problem. Even prior to the outbreak of war, many analysts were predicting that low oil prices could also put Iraq into a severe economic crisis. The Iraqi economy being so dependent upon oil prices, and also with most jobs being very dependent, many jobs being dependent on the public sector, the government is really at risk of not being able to pay the bills. So I think, it's really in that context, I think, of an economic crisis where I see, the greatest potential for really strong protest or problems with social cohesion right now. Unfortunately, I think the government, with the help of the militias, was able to really put down the Tishreen movement, and through changes to things like the electoral law, has pretty effectively sidelined some of the independent civil society actors that had been even able to win elected seats in the prior parliament. In the November election, we really saw many of those kind of Tishreen political voices, marginalized. They were not able to regain seats in the parliament. And so, certainly, while there are many in Iraqi society who are opposed to the role of militias, at this point, I think many of those voices are not prominent either in the formal political system or as active in civil society right now. And so it's hard to see at this moment a real move to challenge, this dominance of kind of the Shia political elite in running Iraq.
Thank you. Dr. Hellyer, the one idea that Aslı has mentioned that is a major concern for a regional concern for Ankara is the demise of Iran, demise of Turkey. Sorry, demise of Iran and the Iran influence would lead to a rise of Israel as a major hegemon in the region, and Egypt has suffered from this over the last 2 years because of the war on Gaza and the implications of this war. How does this play in in Cairo's view of the region and the aftermath of this war?
So I confess I'm not entirely sure that's quite how they see it, because if we accepted that frame, then we would be arguing that the Iranian regime has been some sort of check on Israeli paramountcy in the region for the last few years. It hasn't. Israel carried out a genocide, and the Iranians were unable to stop it. Israel has invaded and occupied more Syrian territory that was completely irrelevant to any engagement of Iranian power. Israel has now invaded and occupied yet more Lebanese territory. Again, this was all going on, and I don't think that the Iranians were able to be some sort of counter in this regard. But I do think that there is a wider question here about the demise of the Iranian regime, but also how the regional security architecture would look like if Israeli paramountcy becomes the norm. When it comes to the former, when it comes to the Iranian regime, the common ground in that Venn diagram between the goals of the United States and the goals of Israel is around creating the conditions for regime change in Iran. I don't think anybody in Israel or anybody in the United States really seriously thinks that they're going to be able to collapse the regime as a result of this military pressure right now. I think what they do think is possible and is more plausible is to create the conditions for regime change later down the road. But I think that people have to be very careful about this Pandora's box, because by quote unquote creating the conditions in this fashion, using military force in this way, you're more likely to see, given how Iran is set up, you're more likely to see a fragmentation of Iran as opposed to some sort of transition of any kind. And I think Egypt would be concerned about that for some of the reasons that Turkey is as well, because I think in that scenario, you would probably see an Iranian Kurdish entity arise in the same way that it did in Syria. And I think that would be a red line for Turkey. I think Egypt would just be more concerned about the fragmentation of a pretty big state that would then be awash with weapons and, quite far. It's on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf, but still, it has consequences for its neighbors, and those have consequences for Egypt. On the second point, with regards to Israeli paramountcy, Egypt has been raising the alarm about this for several years now, and calling for some sort of regional security architecture to be formulated. It hasn't gotten very far. You saw the Egyptian president, Sisi, go to Qatar last year in the aftermath of the Israeli strikes on Doha and call for something similar to an Arab NATO. Nobody took it up. Okay, and it was said again, something similar over the last couple of weeks. Again, nobody took it up, and in fact, there were some prominent voices in the Gulf that pushed back very hard against the idea. And in this regard, there's a big quandary here. On the European level, we have a recognition that the United States is not a reliable security guarantor indefinitely, and even now, as we've seen with regards to Ukraine. So there's pretty much a consensus in Europe that we need to move towards another frame where we're able to provide for our own security and resilience and not rely on the United States to do it. It will take a while to get there, but I think there's a consensus that that's where it needs to go. When it comes to the Gulf, this recognition that the United States is not dependable as a single security guarantor has been recognized, but there is no joined up thinking about what to do next. Rather, there's individual bilateral attempts at hedging, not replacing, but hedging. So deepening actually the relationship with the United States when you look at most of the countries in the region, and then trying to get other relationships going on at the same time. But in terms of joined up multilateral thinking within the region itself, you haven't seen that. And I think that's the Achilles heel of trying to come to some sort of sustainable and really constructive regional security architecture.
Thank you. You actually answered one of the questions that we received on the chat from one of the followers, Sima. She asked about, do you see this would trigger efforts for common regional security strategy among Middle East countries?
I would say it should, but I don't think it will.
Yes.
I think it'll take quite some time for that to take place. The political will simply isn't there. Despite the very noble sentiments that are said ad nauseum at various, conferences, and we can all smile because we all remember like Arab League, OIC, joint communiques. They come to nothing. This war has been going on for 3 weeks, and I think there's been one Zoom meeting for all the GCC countries together.
Yeah, there is one I think planned for tomorrow in Jeddah as well.
Congratulations.
Exactly. Aslı, do you think Erdogan would put pressure on President Trump to or has he done? Do you think this would go anywhere?
Look, I think Turkey would eventually start working on an off-ramp and try to do diplomacy of some level of shuttle diplomacy around the region to get Gulf countries on board and present a formula to President Trump if and when he's ready. But I don't think we are there yet. Clearly, there is the whole Strait of Hormuz issue now, prospects of U.S. actually going in with ground troops, whether it's Harg Island or Strait of Hormuz. So the conversation is in a different place now. President Erdogan is probably he can read this the current mood here. I would say he's not calling Trump right now and urging an end to the war, but he probably the fact that Hakan Fidan is now starting, Turkey's foreign minister is starting this regional tour. I think they want to see where other countries are and ultimately want to have a plan ready. We're clearly not there, but it is possible that President Trump will be there at some point. It's obviously impossible to predict him. This war could run for a couple of more weeks, a couple of more months, or he could be tweeting tomorrow that he's ready to end. So I'm not going to even go into, try to guess that. But what Turkey wants, and I think what Egypt wants, and what several other countries want, is more clear. I think that, things getting worse in the region, in the Gulf and inside Iran is also a possibility in the short run, and we're seeing sort of more of a targeting of civilian infrastructure today that has led to a gas field linked to a Qatari gas field being targeted today. That does have dramatic consequences for the people of Iran. And we have Nowruz coming up, and we have heard Prime Minister Netanyahu actually several times urging Iranians to rise up. And so it's not clear where things will go domestically and whether or not President Trump will go with the sort of Israeli encouragement here for an internal sort of mutiny uprising, or if he will be more narrowly focused on Strait of Hormuz and look to wrap this up after possibly, sort of the next few weeks. It's hard to see where this will go, but Turkey doesn't have leverage over Iran, but it does have the ability to, once Gulf countries and regional countries, including Egypt, are on the same page, does have the ability to go to President Trump seeking an off-ramp.
Thank you. Yeah. Dr. Khatib, the land invasion of South Lebanon is a nightmare for the Lebanese government and for the population in South Lebanon. Some have suggested that Israel could invade all the way up to Litani River. How do you anticipate a reaction from the population, from Hezbollah, from France, the US, Arab countries, and President Aoun and his cabinet?
I think it's unlikely that Israel is going to have a repeat of the 1982 to 2000 scenario where Israel basically occupied Lebanon and had troops on the ground, not allowing Lebanese people to cross into that area unless, they go through Israeli checkpoints. And, people are familiar with the years of the Israeli occupation. And of course, throughout that period, there were all kinds of military operations against the Israeli army by Hezbollah, and before Hezbollah, the Lebanese national resistance. Due to all this experience, I don't think Israel will want to repeat that. But what Israel is doing is, first of all, try to exert pressure on Lebanon by threatening this kind of scenario, talking about 100,000 troops potentially coming into Lebanon. It's all to increase the pressure on the Lebanese government to try to get it to stand up to Hezbollah, which, as I was saying in my earlier comments, is simply not a realistic expectation. And the other issue that Israel is doing is actually expand areas that it is already controlling inside Lebanon. Now, there are areas in Mount Hermon and around it which are very strategic and which Israel basically took over after the last war between Hezbollah and Israel. And Israel is trying to expand the presence of Israeli troops on Lebanese territory in this way. Now, when it comes to the second scenario, I think, yes, it is happening and it is likely to expand. And through this, Israel aims to establish a kind of buffer zone to prevent Hezbollah from being able to reach Israeli territory with its rockets. And at the same time, this allows Israel to also exert diplomatic pressure on Lebanon in any future negotiations. So, of course, this is bad news for Lebanon because ultimately, as I said, the Lebanese army is not of a strong enough capacity to be able to really change this kind of dynamic. And I really think that the only way out for Lebanon ultimately is going to be diplomatic, because trying to solve this issue through even increasing the capacity of the Lebanese army is not going to do it, especially because of all the sensitivities that I talked about earlier regarding the Lebanese population that has been supportive of Hezbollah one way or another. The last thing you want is for the Lebanese army to be seen as basically attacking one community in Lebanon.
Thank you. I have 4 more minutes and I want to address several questions. Victoria, quickly, do you think Baghdad or Erbil can do something to stop the any Kurdish fighters getting involved in the war from Kurdistan, Iraq, or maybe stopping the militias from attacking US sites, the PMF or other Iranian-backed militias from attacking US sites? This is a big ask for the two governments. How do you view this?
Well, I think to your second question, I think the position, very clear position from Erbil is that this is the responsibility of Baghdad, that many of these fighters are in effect part of the Iraqi state through the popular mobilization forces, that it's the responsibility of the Iraqi government to compel these, people who are in effect state employees to stop launching attacks not only in federal Iraq, but also against sites in Kurdistan. But I think the reality is that, this is a problem that has kind of become worse over the course of many years as the militias have really continued to entrench themselves into the more official state security apparatus, to become more integrated into the political system, including with probably a record number of parliamentarians that are affiliated with militia groups. And then as they really kind of built their own economic empires. And so I think, the Iraqi government, in effect, now has a problem that has gotten out of control. And I think really is hard pressed to figure out how to confront these more extreme militia groups. And I think we've seen over the course of many years that, when the government has had, I think, even taken minimal steps to really challenge the militia groups, those steps have been undermined at times by the judiciary, by other elements within the security forces, who have tried to avoid actually taking action. So I think that's kind of the sad reality there. In terms of what the government can do to prevent, the Iranian Kurdish groups from crossing, there's probably limited steps that they could take. And, at times, the Iraqi government has even moved these Kurdish groups just farther and farther from the border, to try to discourage and prevent their ability to cross. I think what we're seeing now is many of the Iranian Kurdish groups themselves are not eager to cross at a moment when, they have really uncertain support from the United States and Israel, and probably a limited ability to affect real change on the ground. And so I think that probably more than anything is what is preventing, this possible armed Iranian Kurdish opposition.
Thank you, Victoria. Dr. Hellyer, the Houthis are not yet involved in the war, and they could really cause a harm on the Egyptian economy if they close Bab el-Mandeb and eventually close the traffic to Suez Canal. If they move toward closing Bab el-Mandeb Strait, do you see the Egyptian government, military being involved in a way or another?
Because things couldn't get any worse, is what you're trying to say? Thank you, Anas, for making a dismal situation even worse. But honestly, I think that is the next step on the escalation ladder, because as we've seen, just earlier today, the Israelis struck the Iranian fields. The Iranians have now responded to the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis, saying, everybody leave your oil and gas fields, i.e., we're going to strike them. If the Houthis effectively close Bab el-Mandeb in the same way that the Hormuz Straits are closed, then I think that you just see ever-growing pressure on world energy supplies, the cost of oil, and so on. I don't think you would see the Egyptian army move, at least unilaterally. They didn't do that when it came to Houthi attacks and Houthi strikes and piracy over the last few years. I don't think that they would do it now. I think that they would be far more amenable to some sort of coalition getting involved when it comes to Bab el-Mandeb, but going it alone, I don't think so. And by the way, I don't think that they would go it alone. I think that there would be many that would come in order to try to avoid something similar to what happened in the Straits of Hormuz.
Okay, thank you so much. Aslı, my last question is for you. President Trump is trying to get the Europeans involved right now. and Turkey is part of the NATO, and he has been hinting that NATO is not helping the US. How do you see Turkish role playing into this, if there has been any further escalation, spillover of the war, or if the situation continued? If you can answer this in 1 minute, 1 minute and a half. Sorry, I know
Sure.
this is...
Europeans are not going to get involved. They've just seen United States weaponize their dependence on US for their own defense in conflict, in issues like claiming Greenland or sort of President Trump's negotiation process with Russia. So this is payback time. I don't think they can militarily, but they also will not help out US in this effort to sort of get control Strait of Hormuz. As for Turkey, this presents an opportunity to improve ties with NATO partners in the United States. It has long-standing issues with its NATO partners, including sanctions on arms sales, and Turkey is still under CAATSA sanctions because of its purchase for S-400 missiles from Russia. I think this situation, as bleak as it is, does present an opportunity for Turkey to sort of put this whole S-400 issue in a parenthesis, since it's inoperable, and maybe find a formula that would be palatable to Turkish public, but also appease US Congress, so that things could move forward ahead of, so that sanctions could be lifted ahead of the NATO summit, which will take place in Ankara this summer in July. It's very important that Turkey enter that summit with no sanctions, and I think there are steps it can take as this war wages on to do away with the sanctions regime.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. I really learned a lot today. And Dr. Lina, also, thank you to your cat for joining the discussion. That was a very, probably we had a very interesting discussion for the cat as well.
She's
thank you all
Persian, so very much
exactly
on
She's
topic.
directly involved in the topic. Tomorrow we have a panel on the maritime security and impact on international trade and energy security. I hope everyone can join us. Thank you for your time, and I wish you all a great day.
Thank you, Anas.
Bye,
Thank you.
Anas.
Thank you.